Jukebox Journeys, where one song leads to another, stories connect across generations, and music reminds us why it mattered in the first place. Welcome to Boss B's Jukebox Journey. Tonight's show is a little different, and I want to explain that right up front. Boss B is live with you, but her voice needs a short break. Instead of skipping the show, we're doing something new tonight. This is a documentary-style jukebox journey. I'll guide the journey, and the story will be told through images and narration. Boss B is here producing the show live and hanging out with the chat. Tonight, we're slowing things down and focusing on one artist. This Christmas stop is all about Elvis Presley. So settle in, let the story breathe, and let's start tonight's journey. People think of Elvis Presley and Christmas, they often think of familiar songs that return year after year. It's a special tradition many enjoy. What's less discussed is how unexpected that connection once was. Christmas music, especially in popular culture, has always carried risk. For many artists, it was considered seasonal, temporary, and sometimes career-limiting. Yet over time, Elvis became inseparable from the sound of Christmas itself, truly cementing his legacy in holiday music forever. His recordings didn't fade when the season ended. They returned, again and again. This journey looks at how that happened, Ted. Not quickly, not accidentally, but through a combination of background, belief, and timing. To understand Elvis at Christmas, we have to start long before the records, the television specials, or the charts.
Elvis Aaron Presley was born into a world where Christmas did not arrive wrapped in excess. It didn't arrive loudly. It didn't arrive with spectacle or abundance. In Tupelo, Mississippi, Christmas came quietly, shaped by circumstance, faith, and the simple act of being together when there wasn't much else to lean on. For the Presley family, Christmas was never about what you received. It was about what endured. Elvis grew up in a home where money was scarce and security was fragile. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, lived close to the margins, and that reality shaped how the seasons were experienced. Christmas wasn't something separate from the rest of the year. It was an extension of daily life, marked by reflection, prayer, and music shared in close quarters. Music, especially gospel music, filled the space where material comfort could not. From an early age, Elvis was surrounded by sound that carried meaning. Church wasn't just a place people went on Sundays. It was a cornerstone of community life. And within those walls, music wasn't performed, it was lived. Voices rose together not for attention, but for connection. Harmonies weren't polished, but they were sincere. This mattered, because long before Elvis became a cultural force, before he became a symbol, before his voice was amplified through radios and records, he learned something essential about music. Emotion matters more than volume. Christmas hymns weren't decorative. They weren't seasonal entertainment. They were expressions of belief, hope, and endurance. Songs about peace and joy existed alongside the reality of hardship. That contrast, celebration living next to struggle, shaped how Elvis understood both Christmas and music itself. As a boy, Elvis absorbed these sounds instinctively. He didn't analyze them. He didn't categorize them. He felt them, and those feelings stayed with him long after childhood faded into memory. When the Presley family eventually moved to Memphis, the musical landscape widened, but the foundation didn't change. Blues, country, rhythm and blues, all of it layered on top of gospel rather than replacing it. Gospel remained the emotional core. Christmas music, in particular, never became novelty to Elvis. It never became something extra. It was woven into the same emotional fabric as everything else he sang. That's an important distinction, because for many artists, Christmas songs are something you add on. For Elvis, Christmas songs were something he returned to. As his career began to take shape, the industry around him moved fast. Fame arrived quickly, and with it came pressure, expectations, schedules, decisions that could shape or derail momentum. But even as the machinery of celebrity began to form around him, those early lessons stayed intact. Elvis never lost the sense that music was meant to communicate something real. That belief would later become especially visible in how he approached holiday recordings. Where others leaned into cheer, Elvis leaned into sincerity. Where others chased brightness, he trusted restraint. When you listen closely to Elvis's Christmas performances, what stands out is not extravagance, it's control. He allows space between lines. He lets notes settle. He resists the urge to oversell emotion. That restraint comes directly from gospel tradition. In church, songs aren't rushed. They breathe. Silence matters. The pause between phrases carries weight. Elvis internalized that pacing early, and it shaped his musical instincts long before he had language for it. Christmas, for Elvis, was never a performance. It was a memory. It carried the image of candlelight against winter darkness. It carried the sound of voices blending together, imperfect but unified. It carried the understanding that joy doesn't erase hardship, it coexists with it. This is why his Christmas recordings would later feel different from so many others. They weren't trying to manufacture nostalgia. They were rooted in it. Even as Elvis's sound evolved, even as arrangements became more sophisticated and production values increased, that grounding never disappeared. It showed up in phrasing. It showed up in tone. It showed up in the way he approached songs that required vulnerability instead of bravado. When Elvis sang Christmas material, he wasn't stepping outside himself. He was stepping closer to who he had always been. That's why listeners sensed something familiar in those recordings, even if they couldn't articulate it. The songs felt lived in. They felt personal. They felt honest. And honesty travels farther than novelty ever does. As the years passed and Elvis's career accelerated, those early Christmas memories didn't fade. They remained accessible, ready to be drawn from when the moment arrived. Because when Elvis finally stood in front of a microphone to record Christmas songs, he wasn't inventing a mood. He was revisiting a feeling he had carried for most of his life. That difference is subtle, but it's everything. It explains why his Christmas music wouldn't feel dated. It explains why it wouldn't feel forced. It explains why it would endure. When Elvis sang about Christmas, he wasn't borrowing sentiment. He was returning to it. As Elvis moved out of childhood and into adolescence, the world around him began to change, but the way he related to music did not. The sounds he had absorbed in church and at home continued to shape how he listened, how he felt, and eventually, how he sang. Even as new influences entered his life, they did not replace the old ones. They layered on top of them. Christmas remained part of that foundation. For Elvis, the season was not something that arrived suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. It unfolded slowly. It carried anticipation, reflection, and familiarity. The music associated with Christmas was not meant to dazzle. It was meant to comfort. And that distinction stayed with him. As a teenager, Elvis was not yet thinking about recording studios or audiences beyond his immediate surroundings. He was thinking about sound, how it moved people, how it filled spaces, how it made moments feel larger than they were. Music was already becoming a way for him to communicate things he didn't always know how to say. That emotional sensitivity is important to understand, because Christmas music requires a different kind of presence. It doesn't reward excess. It responds to sincerity. It asks the singer to meet the listener where they are, not where the performer wants to be seen. Elvis learned that instinctively. When he sang, even informally, there was a sense of attentiveness in his delivery. He listened to himself as much as he projected outward. That habit came from gospel tradition, where the voice is not used to dominate, but to contribute. Harmony matters. Balance matters. Timing matters. Those lessons became especially relevant during Christmas, when music often functions as shared experience rather than individual expression. The songs are familiar. The listener knows where they are going. The singer's role is not to surprise, but to honor. This understanding shaped Elvis's relationship with holiday music long before he ever recorded it. As his exposure to different musical styles increased, Christmas remained a constant reference point. Blues and country introduced him to storytelling. Rhythm and blues introduced him to phrasing and groove. But gospel, and the Christmas hymns tied to it, taught him emotional pacing. They taught him when to hold back. They taught him that silence can be as meaningful as sound. That restraint would later become one of the defining qualities of his Christmas recordings. When Elvis eventually stepped into professional environments, those instincts didn't disappear. They were simply carried forward into new contexts. Even under pressure, even as expectations mounted, he retained a sense that music should feel grounded rather than performative. Christmas music, especially, demanded that grounding. Many artists struggle with holiday material because it exposes insincerity quickly, often faster than any other type of music. Christmas songs arrive already carrying emotional weight, memory, and expectation, and listeners do not meet them with neutrality. They bring their own histories into the sound. They remember where they were, who they were with, and what they were feeling the last time they heard these songs. Because of that, even subtle exaggeration or artificiality becomes obvious. If a performance feels forced, the listener senses it immediately. If it feels calculated, the listener pulls away just as quickly. Elvis understood this instinctively, whether he could have articulated it or not. He did not approach Christmas songs as opportunities to impress, to elevate himself, or to prove anything about his voice or his image. He approached them as opportunities to connect, and that difference shaped every decision that followed. Connection, for Elvis, was never theoretical. It was grounded in lived experience. It came from winter evenings where music filled quiet rooms without demanding attention. It came from voices rising together without concern for polish or perfection. It came from belief systems that valued humility, reflection, and shared emotion over performance and display. Those early experiences shaped not only what Elvis sang, but how he sang. Even before fame arrived, his voice carried emotional nuance. He did not flatten songs into uniform expressions or treat them as vehicles for spectacle. He allowed them to breathe. He allowed pauses to exist. He allowed emotion to emerge naturally rather than forcing it forward. That instinct translated especially well to Christmas music, which depends far more on emotional shading than dramatic contrast. As Elvis matured, the meaning of Christmas in his life evolved, but it never lost its emotional gravity. The season remained a touchstone, a reminder of where he came from and what music meant before it became a profession. Long before recording contracts, charts, and expectations entered the picture, Christmas represented something grounding. It was a time when music served people rather than the other way around. That grounding would later give Elvis's Christmas recordings a sense of continuity that listeners responded to, often without consciously realizing why. The songs did not feel like departures from his identity. They felt like returns. Returns to belief. Returns to memory. Returns to sincerity. Even as arrangements became more sophisticated and production values increased, the emotional center remained unchanged. By the time Elvis was ready to record holiday music professionally, he had already lived with these songs for most of his life. The sound, the mood, and the pacing did not need to be invented or carefully constructed. They were already present, waiting to be expressed. That is what separates Elvis's Christmas work from so many others. It did not emerge from strategy, marketing, or positioning. It emerged from lived experience. This distinction matters because Christmas music does not tolerate distance between the singer and the material. Listeners instinctively recognize when an artist is visiting the season rather than belonging to it. Elvis belonged to it. His relationship with Christmas music was not transactional. It was personal. It was embedded in how he understood music itself. That embedded understanding meant Elvis did not need to exaggerate emotion to make it land. He trusted restraint. He trusted silence. He trusted the listener. In a culture increasingly driven by spectacle, speed, and constant stimulation, this approach stood out quietly. It did not demand attention, but it held it. When Elvis sang Christmas songs, he was not stepping outside himself to meet an expectation. He was stepping closer to something familiar, something foundational. That closeness is what gave his recordings credibility and staying power. It allowed the music to feel sincere rather than seasonal, grounded rather than decorative. Another reason this approach worked is because Elvis understood that Christmas music often carries unresolved emotion. For many listeners, the season is not purely joyful. It is reflective. It can be heavy. It can bring absence into focus as clearly as presence. Elvis did not shy away from that reality. He did not attempt to smooth it over or replace it with forced cheer. His Christmas performances allowed room for complexity. That complexity made the music usable in real life. It could play during moments of celebration, but it could also exist quietly during moments of reflection. It could accompany conversation, memory, or solitude without demanding attention. That flexibility is rare, and it is one of the reasons Elvis's Christmas recordings endured. Elvis also understood that Christmas music functions differently than most popular music. It is not consumed for novelty. It is returned to. Listeners do not search for it because it is new. They return because it feels familiar. That familiarity requires trust, and trust is built slowly through sincerity and consistency. Because Elvis did not treat Christmas music as a performance opportunity, he allowed listeners to project their own experiences into it. He did not tell people how to feel about the season. He did not prescribe happiness or enforce cheer. He allowed the songs to exist as companions rather than statements. This respect for the listener created an emotional bond that deepened over time. The music did not age out. It aged in. Each year it returned, it carried more memory rather than less. That accumulation of meaning is what turns recordings into tradition. When people later describe Elvis's Christmas music as timeless, what they are often responding to is this absence of urgency. The songs do not rush. They do not chase attention. They do not compete with the season. They sit within it. That quality can only come from an artist who understands that music does not always need to lead. Sometimes it needs to support. Elvis learned that lesson early, long before he ever stepped into a recording studio, and he carried it with him into every Christmas song he recorded. And that understanding, shaped in small rooms and quiet seasons, would soon be tested on a much larger stage, where Christmas music carried risk, expectation, and consequence far beyond the private spaces where Elvis first learned its power. As Elvis moved further from childhood and closer to adulthood, Christmas began to change shape in his life, not by becoming less important, but by becoming more layered. The season no longer existed only as anticipation or ritual. It became reflective. It carried memory forward instead of simply arriving and passing. Christmas began to represent continuity, a reminder that some things remained steady even as everything else began to shift. Music was central to that steadiness. Elvis had grown up watching how music functioned during the holidays, not as entertainment but as atmosphere. Christmas songs didn't interrupt daily life, they settled into it. They accompanied meals, conversations, moments of quiet, and moments of prayer. They were not meant to command attention. They were meant to support presence. That distinction stayed with him. In the churches of his youth, Christmas music was never rushed. Hymns unfolded slowly, allowing space for voices to meet one another without urgency. Emotion was not pushed forward, it was allowed to surface naturally. Silence was not treated as absence, but as part of the sound itself. Elvis absorbed this pacing long before he ever stood in front of an audience. As he grew older, he began to understand instinctively that some music asks for projection, while other music asks for restraint. Christmas belonged to the latter. It did not reward excess. It responded to sincerity. It required the singer to listen as much as they sang. Elvis learned to respect that balance early. By adolescence, music was no longer just something Elvis experienced passively. It had become a language he used to understand the world around him. He noticed how certain songs changed the emotional temperature of a room. Christmas music did not energize or excite in the way popular music often did. It softened, it slowed time, it made space for reflection without demanding explanation. That quality mattered to him. Christmas songs allowed people to sit with feeling rather than escape it. They acknowledged joy without denying difficulty. They recognized hope without pretending it was uncomplicated. Elvis recognized that emotional honesty, even if he did not yet have the words to describe it. As new influences entered his life, blues, country, rhythm and blues, they did not replace the foundation laid by gospel and Christmas hymns. They layered on top of it. Those newer sounds taught him storytelling, phrasing, and groove. But Christmas music taught him pacing. It taught him when to hold back. It taught him that emotional power often comes from what is withheld rather than what is declared. This understanding shaped how Elvis approached music long before he recorded anything professionally. In gospel tradition, the voice exists in relationship to other voices. It is not meant to dominate. It is meant to blend, to support, to contribute. Harmony matters. Balance matters. Timing matters. Christmas music carries those same expectations. The song is larger than the singer. The moment is shared, not claimed. Elvis internalized this deeply. When he sang informally, at home, among friends, or in small settings, there was an attentiveness in his delivery. He listened to himself as much as he projected outward. He allowed phrases to settle. He respected the weight of familiar melodies. That attentiveness would later become one of the most recognizable qualities of his recorded work. As Elvis's world expanded, Christmas remained one of the few constants. It did not change with geography or circumstance. It arrived each year with the same emotional cues, asking the same quiet questions. Who are you now? Who were you then? What remains? Music provided a way to sit with those questions without answering them directly. Christmas songs, especially, allowed for emotional complexity without requiring resolution. They could hold longing and gratitude in the same moment. They could acknowledge absence without naming it. Elvis did not resist those qualities. He understood them as honest reflections of real life. That honesty became increasingly important as his life began to move faster. As expectations grew and pressures mounted, Christmas remained a space where vulnerability was allowed. It did not demand performance. It did not require explanation. It invited presence. Elvis did not see Christmas music as something separate from the rest of his musical identity. He saw it as part of the same emotional continuum. The same instincts that guided his gospel singing guided his understanding of Christmas. The same restraint, the same respect for silence, the same attention to emotional truth. This continuity is what prepared him for what came later. Because once Elvis stepped fully into the public eye, Christmas music would no longer exist only as memory. It would become expectation. It would become product. It would become something others had opinions about. But at this stage in his life, Christmas music was still personal. It was still private. It was still rooted in experience rather than outcome. And that grounding, formed slowly, quietly, without intention, would soon be tested in ways Elvis could not yet predict. Before Elvis ever faced the question of whether Christmas music fit into popular culture, he had already spent years watching how people carried the season internally. Christmas was not something that announced itself with excitement in his early life. It arrived quietly, often mixed with expectation and restraint rather than certainty. That quiet arrival shaped how he understood the emotional role music could play during the season. Elvis learned early that Christmas did not belong only to children or celebration. It belonged equally to adults who carried worry, memory, and responsibility. He saw how music softened those things, not by erasing them, but by giving them a place to sit. A hymn could hold joy and grief at the same time without resolving either one, and that ability stayed with him. In churches and living rooms, Christmas songs functioned less like performances and more like shared pauses. People didn't sing to be impressive. They sang because the songs helped them stop for a moment. That pause mattered. It allowed reflection without explanation. It allowed people to feel something without needing to justify it. Elvis paid attention to that. He noticed that the songs people returned to year after year were not always the loudest or the most elaborate. They were the ones that felt steady. The ones that didn't change much. The ones that made space rather than filling it. Christmas music, when it worked, did not demand emotion, it received it. This understanding shaped how Elvis thought about singing long before he ever stepped onto a professional stage. He learned that some songs ask the singer to step back rather than forward. That lesson would later become crucial when navigating music that already belonged to the listener. As Elvis grew older and his exposure to music expanded, this idea followed him. Blues and country taught him storytelling. Rhythm and blues taught him groove and phrasing. But Christmas music taught him something else entirely: containment. It taught him that not every feeling needs to be amplified to be felt. That containment is rare in popular music, especially for young artists. Youth culture often rewards intensity, speed, and novelty. Christmas music operates by different rules. It values familiarity over surprise and presence over performance. Elvis understood those rules instinctively because he had lived with them. By the time fame entered the picture, Elvis already carried a private understanding of how music could exist without demanding attention. That understanding would quietly guide him when the world began watching every move he made. By the time Elvis Presley entered the national spotlight, popular music was changing faster than anyone could fully understand in real time. Rock and roll was still new, still disruptive, still controversial. It was youth-driven, restless, and loud in ways that unsettled older audiences and industry gatekeepers alike. Within that landscape, Christmas music occupied a very different space. Holiday recordings were traditionally conservative. They were tied to crooners, orchestras, and voices that felt polished and safe. Christmas albums belonged to artists who were already established, already accepted, already finished proving themselves. They were not considered vehicles for momentum. They were considered pauses. For artists on the rise, that pause could be dangerous. Recording Christmas music meant stepping outside the urgency of the moment. It meant risking being seen as sentimental, or worse, disposable. Once an artist became associated too closely with holiday material, there was a fear they might be returned to only once a year, then quietly set aside. This is why many popular performers avoided Christmas albums altogether during the early years of rock and roll. The genre itself was still fighting for legitimacy. Associating it with tradition and nostalgia felt counterintuitive, even risky. Elvis Presley stood directly in the center of that tension. His rise was meteoric. His sound challenged norms. His image provoked debate. He represented something new, something urgent, something that felt untamed. Every move he made carried weight far beyond a single release. So when the idea of Christmas recordings emerged, it wasn't a casual decision. It was a calculation. Would recording Christmas music soften his image? Would it confuse audiences who saw him as rebellious or modern? Would it interrupt the momentum of a career that seemed to be rewriting popular music in real time? These were not abstract concerns whispered in boardrooms. They were real anxieties shared by managers, labels, and industry professionals watching a phenomenon unfold faster than anyone could control. Christmas music, after all, does not thrive on shock or novelty. It thrives on familiarity. It asks the artist to step into something already beloved, already emotionally charged. For someone like Elvis, whose appeal was partly built on disruption, that step carried risk. But Elvis approached the question differently. Rather than asking what Christmas music might take away from his image, he seemed to understand what it could reveal. Christmas songs offered a space where sincerity mattered more than spectacle, where emotional presence mattered more than trend. This was not a pivot away from his identity. It was an opportunity to show its depth. Elvis did not try to reshape Christmas music into rock and roll. He did not inject irony or exaggeration into it. He did not attempt to modernize it beyond recognition. Instead, he approached it with the same seriousness he brought to gospel and ballads. That choice mattered. This understanding aligned naturally with the instincts Elvis had already developed. He did not view Christmas music as an interruption to momentum, but as part of a broader emotional continuum. The same qualities that shaped his gospel singing, restraint, pacing, emotional control, applied equally to holiday material. Rather than forcing Christmas music to conform to rock and roll, Elvis allowed it to remain itself. That decision mattered. Instead of modernizing Christmas music aggressively or reshaping it to fit current trends, Elvis approached it with respect. He did not exaggerate cheer or inject irony. He did not attempt to dominate familiar melodies. He trusted the material and trusted the listener. This approach ran counter to industry instinct, which often favored visibility over subtlety. But Elvis understood something that strategy alone could not account for. Christmas music operates on a different timeline. It is not consumed once and discarded. It is returned to. It accumulates meaning through repetition rather than novelty. By treating Christmas music seriously, Elvis positioned himself within a tradition rather than above it. He did not attempt to own the season or redefine it. He entered it carefully, allowing his voice to become part of something larger than his individual career. At this stage, the outcome was still uncertain. No one could predict how audiences would respond or whether the gamble would pay off. But Elvis was not approaching Christmas music as a gamble. He was approaching it as an extension of who he already was, an artist shaped by memory, faith, restraint, and emotional truth. That alignment between personal instinct and artistic choice set the stage for what would happen next, when these recordings met the public and revealed that the perceived risk had been misunderstood all along. When Elvis's Christmas recordings reached the public, the response did not arrive with spectacle or controversy. There was no dramatic backlash, no sense that something had gone wrong, and no indication that his momentum had slowed. In an industry accustomed to loud reactions and sharp turns, the absence of disruption was itself meaningful. Instead of rejection or confusion, something quieter occurred. People listened, and then, without instruction or urgency, they listened again. What listeners responded to was not novelty. It was tone. The recordings did not feel like experiments or seasonal detours. They felt settled. They carried a calm assurance that stood in contrast to the intensity surrounding much of Elvis's non-seasonal work. The songs did not try to redefine Christmas or reposition Elvis within it. They allowed him to exist inside the season without explanation. That mattered more than anyone initially realized. Listeners did not experience these recordings as a shift in identity. They experienced them as an expansion. Elvis did not appear diminished or softened. He appeared more dimensional. The Christmas songs revealed emotional restraint and control at a moment when excess often defined popularity. That restraint did not distance listeners. It drew them closer. The industry noticed. Programmers and executives who had once viewed holiday albums as calculated risks began to reassess their assumptions. The expected trade-offs did not materialize. Elvis had not lost relevance. He had not confused his audience. He had not interrupted the trajectory of his career. Instead, he had added another layer to it. What became clear over time was that these recordings were not dependent on promotion to remain present. They resurfaced naturally. When December returned, so did the songs. They were requested, they were replayed, they were woven into seasonal listening habits without prompting. This pattern repeated itself year after year. Unlike many holiday recordings that spike briefly and disappear, Elvis's Christmas music established continuity. It returned with familiarity rather than urgency. It did not rely on novelty to justify its presence. It relied on trust. Listeners trusted the tone. They trusted the pacing. They trusted the sincerity behind the performance. Trust, once established, changes the relationship between music and audience. Instead of approaching the songs as products, listeners approached them as companions to the season. They played during moments that did not require attention or analysis. They accompanied meals, travel, quiet evenings, and family gatherings. They existed alongside memory rather than competing with it. Over time, the recordings began to detach from their original release context. New listeners encountered them without knowledge of the risk they once represented or the cultural moment they emerged from. They were not hearing a strategic decision. They were hearing something that felt appropriate, familiar, and emotionally grounded. That detachment allowed the music to age differently.
We're going to pause the journey right here for a short break. If you're watching live, thanks for staying with us. This is where we step out of the story for just a moment. Boss B is still here with you, producing the show live. Right now, we're going to play a song from the channel. This one is called Boss B Risin', written and produced by our very own Boss B.
She came from the quiet storms, built a fire from the ground, turned a whisper to a warning. Now her voice shakes the town. Every setback was a lesson, every doubt became a key, unlocking something bigger. That's the rise of Boss B. When the lights go low, her vision hits high. She built a whole damn network off a promise and a try. Every sunrise, every moment, she's stacking legacy. This ain't just a channel, this is BBTV. Boss B rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel road to the neon dream, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss B rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. She's the queen of the comeback, the storm in the stream, crafting stories out of heartbeats, making visions out of dreams. Got thunder in the hustle, got a voice that cuts clean. Every mic she touches turns the power unseen. So let burgers spin the numbers, let the views rise slow or fast. Boss B doesn't measure wins by echoes of the past. This moment is a pivot, this season's history. Bow down to the founder of the BBTV dynasty. Boss B rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dream, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss B rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. She's got fire in the head, it's got truth in the frame, got a heart that won't retire and a gift you can't name. Every loop, every letter, every dream she sets free, it's a love note to the world sign. Boss B. And the world keeps watching as the numbers climb, but she's counting all the moments, not the dollar signs. From the late night grind to the daylight scene, she's building something bigger than the algorithm's dream. Boss B rising, BBTV shining, her story's rewriting, a legacy in real time. Boss B rising, BBTV take her place. This is BBTV. This is her grace.
Join Boss B for Ask a Bee Monday through Friday, 12 noon Central Standard Time and Jukebox Journey every Saturday, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time.
That song always brings the right kind of energy. You're watching BBTV, where stories and creativity come together. BBTV is part of the Iron Sharpening Iron universe. Thanks for supporting independent creators and original work. Now let's return to tonight's Jukebox Journey. Here's the second half of our Christmas stop with Elvis.
While much of popular music is anchored to specific moments in time, Elvis's Christmas recordings began to function outside of chronology. They were not revisited as artifacts. They were returned to as rituals. Each year reinforced their place, not through reinvention, but through repetition. Radio stations recognized this shift as well. Songs expected to fade instead became fixtures. They reappeared each December with the same ease as decorations retrieved from storage. There was no sense of revival or rediscovery. The music simply resumed its place. This is how seasonal music becomes traditional. The transition does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, as familiarity replaces novelty and trust replaces curiosity. Elvis's Christmas recordings crossed that threshold quietly. They stopped belonging to a moment and began belonging to the season itself. By this point, the original concerns surrounding Christmas music had dissolved entirely. What was once viewed as a potential interruption to momentum had become a stabilizing foundation. The songs no longer asked to be evaluated. They were accepted. Within that acceptance, another emotional layer began to emerge. Beneath the warmth and familiarity, there was room for longing, reflection, and absence. The joy remained, but it was no longer singular. It was textured. It acknowledged complexity without explanation. This emotional depth distinguished Elvis's Christmas music from many others that insisted on uncomplicated cheer. It also prepared listeners for what would come next. Because at the center of this evolving relationship between Elvis, Christmas, and the public was a song that did not deny longing, but embraced it. A song that recognized that the season can be both beautiful and heavy at the same time. This is where the story deepens. This is where Blue Christmas moves from recording to feeling. By the time Elvis Presley entered the national spotlight, popular music was changing faster than anyone could fully understand in real time. Rock and roll was still new, still disruptive, still controversial. It was youth-driven, restless, and loud in ways that unsettled older audiences and industry gatekeepers alike. Within that landscape, Christmas music occupied a very different space. Holiday recordings were traditionally conservative. They were tied to crooners, orchestras, and voices that felt polished and safe. Christmas albums belonged to artists who were already established, already accepted, already finished proving themselves. They were not considered vehicles for momentum. They were considered pauses. For artists on the rise, that pause could be dangerous. Recording Christmas music meant stepping outside the urgency of the moment. It meant risking being seen as sentimental, or worse, disposable. Once an artist became associated too closely with holiday material, there was a fear they might be returned to only once a year, then quietly set aside. This is why many popular performers avoided Christmas albums altogether during the early years of rock and roll. The genre itself was still fighting for legitimacy. Associating it with tradition and nostalgia felt counterintuitive, even risky. Elvis Presley stood directly in the center of that tension. His rise was meteoric. His sound challenged norms. His image provoked debate. He represented something new, something urgent, something that felt untamed. Every move he made carried weight far beyond a single release. So when the idea of Christmas recordings emerged, it wasn't a casual decision. It was a calculation. Would recording Christmas music soften his image? Would it confuse audiences who saw him as rebellious or modern? Would it interrupt the momentum of a career that seemed to be rewriting popular music in real time? These were not abstract concerns whispered in boardrooms. They were real anxieties shared by managers, labels, and industry professionals watching a phenomenon unfold faster than anyone could control. Christmas music, after all, does not thrive on shock or novelty. It thrives on familiarity. It asks the artist to step into something already beloved, already emotionally charged. for someone like Elvis, whose appeal was partly built on disruption, that step carried risk. But Elvis approached the question differently. Rather than asking what Christmas music might take away from his image, he seemed to understand what it could reveal. Christmas songs offered a space where sincerity mattered more than spectacle, where emotional presence mattered more than trend. This was not a pivot away from his identity. It was an opportunity to show its depth. Elvis did not try to reshape Christmas music into rock and roll. He did not inject irony or exaggeration into it. He did not attempt to modernize it beyond recognition. Instead, he approached it with the same seriousness he brought to gospel and ballads. That choice mattered. By refusing to treat Christmas as novelty, Elvis removed much of the risk others feared. He didn't position the music as a side project or a seasonal gimmick. He treated it as meaningful work, worthy of attention and respect. This approach subtly challenged industry assumptions. If Christmas music could be sincere, grounded, and emotionally authentic, then perhaps it didn't have to halt momentum. Perhaps it could deepen an artist's connection with audiences rather than dilute it. Elvis's instinct to lean into sincerity rather than novelty was not accidental. It reflected his upbringing, his relationship with gospel music, and his understanding that audiences respond to honesty even when they don't consciously recognize it. In an era obsessed with image control, Elvis trusted emotional truth. That trust allowed him to navigate a space many artists feared. He didn't avoid Christmas music. He entered it carefully, respectfully, and on his own terms. And in doing so, he began to change how popular music viewed the holiday season. Christmas no longer had to exist outside contemporary culture. It could coexist with modern sound and evolving identity, if handled with care. This moment marked the beginning of a quiet shift, not yet visible in charts or headlines, but present in how listeners responded. Elvis's willingness to step into Christmas music without sacrificing sincerity laid the groundwork for what would come next. Because once the music was released, something unexpected happened. The audience didn't see a detour. They saw continuity, and that realization would soon turn perceived risk into lasting influence. When Elvis's Christmas recordings reached the public, the reaction did not arrive with spectacle or controversy. There was no dramatic cultural backlash, no sense that something had gone wrong, and no evidence that his momentum had stalled. Instead, something quieter happened, something far more consequential in the long run. People listened, and then they listened again. What listeners responded to was not the novelty of hearing Elvis sing Christmas music, but the emotional tone he brought to it. The songs felt familiar without feeling recycled, reverent without becoming stiff, and sincere without trying to prove anything. Rather than sounding like seasonal detours, the recordings felt like they belonged naturally alongside the rest of his work, as though Christmas had always been part of his musical language rather than something added on later. That sense of belonging changed the equation entirely. Instead of interrupting Elvis's rise, the Christmas recordings folded into it, revealing depth rather than distraction. Audiences did not experience them as pauses in momentum, but as moments of reflection that added dimension to an artist who was already reshaping popular music. This response caught the industry's attention. Executives and programmers who had once treated holiday albums as calculated risks began to recognize that something different was happening here. Elvis had not softened his image or diluted his appeal. If anything, the recordings expanded the public's understanding of who he was. They showed restraint, emotional control, and sincerity at a time when excess often defined popularity. Listeners didn't step away. They leaned closer. The real shift became visible over time. These songs did not disappear once the holiday season ended. They returned the following December, and then again the year after that, not because of aggressive promotion, but because people sought them out. That pattern revealed something important. The music was no longer tied to its release moment. It was attaching itself to memory. Radio stations noticed. Songs that were expected to fade after a few weeks instead held their place in rotation, reappearing each season with the same familiarity as decorations pulled from storage. They didn't rely on novelty to stay relevant. They relied on trust. Trust is rare in popular music, especially across decades. It cannot be manufactured, and it cannot be rushed. It forms when listeners believe that what they are hearing is honest, and when that honesty remains intact over time. Elvis's Christmas recordings earned that trust slowly, year by year, until they became part of the background fabric of the season itself. As this trust grew, industry perceptions began to shift. Christmas music no longer looked like an inevitable career detour when approached with sincerity. Elvis had demonstrated that holiday recordings could coexist with modern popularity without diminishing credibility, provided the artist understood the emotional responsibility of the material. Other performers took note, even if quietly. The idea that Christmas albums were only for the safe or the settled began to loosen. Elvis hadn't announced this change, he had modeled it. For audiences, the transformation was more personal. These songs became associated with moments rather than marketing. They played during family gatherings, long drives, quiet evenings, and shared rituals that repeated year after year. Over time, listeners stopped thinking about when the songs had been recorded or why. They simply accepted them as part of Christmas itself. That acceptance marked the true turning point. The music no longer belonged solely to Elvis the artist. It belonged to the season. It existed independently of charts, trends, or career phases, returning each year with the same emotional clarity it had carried from the beginning. As Elvis's fame expanded globally, so did the reach of these recordings. New listeners encountered them without context, and none was required. The songs stood on their own, carrying warmth, restraint, and emotional depth across generations that had no memory of their original release. This is how holiday music becomes tradition. It does not demand attention or rely on spectacle. It waits patiently, confident that it will be needed again. Elvis's Christmas recordings occupied that space, unchanged and dependable, even as the rest of popular music continued to evolve. By the time this pattern fully settled in, the risk that once surrounded the decision to record Christmas music had dissolved entirely. What had once been viewed as a potential interruption to momentum had become a foundation, one that returned every year without fail, reinforcing rather than challenging his legacy. And within that foundation, a deeper emotional current had begun to surface. Beneath the warmth and familiarity, there was room for longing, memory, and absence, elements that reflected a more complex understanding of the season itself. The joy remained, but it was no longer singular. It was layered, textured, and human. This is where the story begins to turn again, as the color subtly shifts and the emotional tone deepens, preparing the ground for a song, and a feeling, that would come to define a different side of Elvis's Christmas legacy. This is where Blue Christmas waits. When people talk about Elvis Presley and Christmas, they almost always talk about it as if it were inevitable, as if his music was always destined to become part of the holiday season. What gets lost in that assumption is how unlikely that outcome actually was, especially at the moment Elvis was rising. Christmas music was not considered a safe place for young artists in the 1950s. It wasn't trendy. It wasn't forward-looking. It didn't help build momentum in a culture that prized novelty and speed. For many performers, Christmas recordings were seen as something you did later, once your career had already peaked, not while it was still being formed. That context matters, because Elvis entered the music world at a time when every move carried risk. Popular music was changing rapidly. Rock and roll itself was still controversial, still viewed with suspicion in many households. Elvis wasn't just navigating fame, he was navigating fear, expectation, and resistance. Against that backdrop, recording Christmas music wasn't just a creative decision. It was a statement about identity. To understand why Elvis approached Christmas the way he did, you have to go back to his earliest relationship with music. Elvis didn't grow up thinking of music as performance first. He grew up thinking of it as presence. In Tupelo, Mississippi, music lived in churches, living rooms, and small gatherings. Gospel music wasn't something you consumed. It was something you participated in. It shaped how emotion was expressed, how stories were told, and how faith and doubt existed side by side. Christmas, in that environment, wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was reflective. Music during the holidays wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to connect. Those early experiences mattered more than people often realize, because they gave Elvis a framework for what Christmas music could be long before he ever recorded a holiday song. As Elvis's career accelerated, the world around him changed faster than he did. Fame arrived suddenly, and with it came pressure to define himself quickly and clearly. Every release was scrutinized. Every appearance was analyzed. Elvis became both a cultural lightning rod and a commercial powerhouse almost overnight. In that environment, artists were often encouraged to avoid anything that could slow the narrative of constant forward motion. Christmas music didn't fit that narrative. It was seasonal by nature. It invited listeners to look backward, to remember, to pause. Those qualities ran counter to the image of youth, rebellion, and momentum that surrounded Elvis at the time. And yet, that tension is exactly where his Christmas work found its power. Instead of treating Christmas as a novelty, Elvis treated it as an extension of his musical roots. He didn't exaggerate cheer or force brightness into his recordings. He allowed space for complexity. His Christmas music acknowledged joy, but it also acknowledged longing. It acknowledged faith without spectacle and emotion without excess. That balance gave the music a sincerity that many holiday recordings lacked. At the time, listeners may not have consciously recognized what made Elvis's Christmas recordings different. But they felt it. The songs didn't demand attention. They invited it. They didn't overwhelm the moment. They accompanied it. That distinction is subtle, but it's the difference between music that fades after a season and music that returns year after year. As formats changed and decades passed, Elvis's Christmas recordings continued to surface. They moved from vinyl to cassette, from cassette to compact disc, from compact disc to digital files and streaming platforms. Through every technological shift, the music survived. Not because it was marketed aggressively, but because listeners kept choosing it. That endurance tells us something important. Elvis's Christmas music didn't survive because it was nostalgic alone. Nostalgia fades when it isn't reinforced by relevance. These songs survived because they were tied to emotional memory. They became part of how people experienced the season itself, not just how they remembered Elvis. As Elvis's mainstream success grew, his Christmas recordings didn't compete with his other work. They occupied a different space. His non-seasonal music captured moments in popular culture. His Christmas music captured moments in private life. That distinction allowed the holiday recordings to age differently. They weren't bound to trends. They were bound to ritual. By the late 1950s and early 60s, it was becoming clear that Elvis's Christmas music was doing something unusual. It wasn't disappearing when the season ended. It wasn't being replaced by newer versions. It was settling in, becoming familiar, becoming expected. This is where Christmas music stops being seasonal and starts becoming traditional. And that transition is rare. Most holiday recordings never make it past their own era. They belong to a specific year, a specific sound, a specific cultural moment. Elvis's Christmas recordings crossed that threshold. They stopped belonging to a moment and started belonging to memory. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because Elvis approached Christmas music with restraint. He didn't try to modernize it aggressively. He didn't chase novelty. He trusted the emotional weight of the material and allowed the songs to speak for themselves. As we move forward in this journey, the focus shifts from how Elvis entered the Christmas landscape to how he came to define it. The next part of the story looks at the songs themselves, the way they shape listener expectations, and why certain recordings, particularly those that acknowledged longing as much as joy, became central to how Christmas sounds in the modern world. When Elvis's Christmas music crossed from seasonal into something permanent, it didn't happen because of a single song or a single moment. It happened gradually, almost invisibly, as the recordings continued to return each year without effort. There was no announcement that these songs had become tradition. They simply refused to leave. That quiet persistence is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Elvis's Christmas legacy, because in popular culture we tend to equate longevity with constant reinvention. Elvis's Christmas music survived by doing the opposite. It stayed exactly where it was and let the world come back to it. One reason these recordings endured is because they acknowledged emotional complexity instead of avoiding it. Christmas music often presents a polished version of the season, one where joy is uninterrupted and longing doesn't exist. Elvis's holiday recordings didn't insist on that version of reality. Songs like Blue Christmas recognized that the season can be isolating, reflective, and bittersweet. That acknowledgement gave the music emotional credibility. It allowed listeners to feel seen instead of instructed. That honesty is subtle, but it matters. Holiday music that denies complexity tends to age poorly because it relies on a fixed emotional expectation. Elvis's Christmas recordings allowed for multiple emotional states at once. Joy could coexist with sadness. Faith could coexist with doubt. Celebration could coexist with memory. That emotional openness made the music flexible enough to fit into different lives, different moments, and different generations. As time passed, Elvis's Christmas recordings began to detach from their original cultural moment. New listeners encountered the songs without the controversy, the fame, or the mythology surrounding Elvis himself. They weren't hearing a cultural icon. They were hearing tone. They were hearing warmth. They were hearing something that felt appropriate to the season without demanding attention. That separation allowed the music to function independently of celebrity, which is rare in popular music. The production choices in Elvis's Christmas recordings also played a role in their longevity. The arrangements were restrained. They avoided excessive ornamentation or stylistic trends that would later date them. Gospel influence anchored the sound in something older and more enduring than pop fashion. As production standards evolved and recording technology changed, these songs remained intelligible and emotionally intact. They didn't need updating because they were never chasing the moment they were created in. As music formats shifted, Elvis's Christmas recordings adapted without effort. Vinyl became cassette. Cassette became compact disc. Compact disc gave way to digital libraries and streaming platforms. Through each transition, the music followed listeners rather than leading them. It remained present because people kept bringing it with them. That kind of survival is driven by habit, memory, and emotional attachment, not promotion. Streaming culture introduced a new way of measuring relevance, yet Elvis's Christmas music continued to perform quietly but consistently. Each December, the songs resurfaced naturally in playlists and searches. They weren't discovered for the first time so much as rediscovered, often by listeners who associated them with earlier stages of life. That rediscovery reinforced the music's role as a marker of time rather than a product of it. What makes Elvis's Christmas legacy particularly unusual is its lack of spectacle. There is no single defining Christmas performance that overshadows the rest. There is no iconic television moment that captures the entire legacy. Instead, the power lies in accumulation. Song after song, year after year, building familiarity without demanding attention. The music doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives. That arrival is gentle. Elvis's Christmas music doesn't dominate a room. It supports it. It doesn't interrupt conversation. It fills space. It exists comfortably in the background, which is where much of life actually happens. That quality is often overlooked in discussions of musical legacy, but it is crucial. Music that insists on being noticed rarely becomes tradition. Music that allows itself to be lived with often does. Another reason these recordings endured is that they respected the listener. They didn't tell people how to feel about the season. They didn't prescribe happiness or enforce cheer. They allowed room for personal interpretation. That respect created trust, and trust is what turns repetition into ritual. As the cultural conversation around Christmas music expanded, Elvis's recordings remained curiously untouched by revision. They weren't remixed to stay relevant. They weren't modernized to fit changing tastes. They were allowed to exist as they were. That restraint preserved their integrity. Instead of becoming artifacts, they became anchors. Elvis's Christmas music also benefited from its connection to faith without being confined by it. Gospel influence informed the sound, but the recordings never excluded listeners who approached the season differently. That openness allowed the music to function across belief systems, cultural backgrounds, and personal experiences. It belonged to Christmas broadly, not narrowly. Over time, these recordings became woven into personal rituals. They were played while cooking, while decorating, while driving, while sitting quietly. They accompanied moments that didn't require performance or attention. They became part of how people moved through the season rather than something they stopped to observe. That integration is what separates enduring holiday music from novelty. In many ways, Elvis's Christmas legacy stands in contrast to how popular culture typically operates. Instead of accelerating, it slows down. Instead of reinventing, it repeats. Instead of pushing forward, it returns. That rhythm aligns naturally with the season itself, which is cyclical rather than progressive. Christmas doesn't move on, it comes back. Elvis didn't attempt to redefine Christmas music. He didn't set out to own the season or reshape it. He brought his full musical self into it and trusted that sincerity would be enough. That trust paid off in ways that couldn't have been predicted at the time. His Christmas recordings outlived trends, formats, and expectations precisely because they never tried to outrun them. Today, when Elvis's Christmas songs play, they no longer feel like recordings from a specific era. They feel like part of the season's environment. They exist alongside lights, decorations, conversations, and memories without competing for attention. They have become part of the texture of Christmas itself. That is the quiet power of legacy. Not volume, not novelty, not reinvention, but presence. Elvis's Christmas music achieved that rare transition from performance to ritual, from product to tradition. And that is why, long after trends have passed and generations have changed, Elvis remains part of how Christmas sounds, not because he insists on being remembered, but because his music continues to make room for people to feel.
It brings us to the end of tonight's Christmas Jukebox Journey. Elvis's music didn't just shape a season, it became part of it. Thanks for spending this time with us, whether you join live or later. Boss B is here every week with stories that slow things down and let them breathe. And if this journey meant something to you, feel free to like, share, or subscribe. Until the next stop, this has been Boss B's Jukebox Journey. Hey family, it's VB. Yes, I'm back. No, Boss B didn't fire me yet, but I am here to remind you you're watching BBTV. And BBTV is not just a channel, it's a whole vibe, just one galaxy in the iron sharpening iron universe, you know? If you love real stories, real talk, and the kind of chaos that feels like group therapy with better jokes, you need to be here for Ask a Bee at 12 p.m. Central. Bring your coffee, bring your snacks, bring your petty. Bees on the mic, the letters are wild, and somebody in the chat always says something that makes it 10 times funnier. And if you're here for music, memories, and the how did we get from this artist to that artist kind of fun stuff, you need Jukebox Journey every Saturday night at 8 p.m. Central, except the last Saturday of the month. That's We Be Jammin' Night. And if you don't know what that is yet, just know it's not quiet and it's not boring. It's amazing, just like me.